From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
President Biden says he's being forced to build a section of border wall against his will as House Republicans jockey in preparation for a vote next week on a new speaker. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, editorial board member Monet Ukwe-Barua and columnist Kim Strassel. The Democratic split personality on the border and the migrant crisis has been on full display this week. New York Mayor Eric Adams went on a PR tour of countries including Mexico and Colombia. And his message is, don't come to New York City. Quote, we need to counteract those forms of communication that are basically saying you come to the city of New York, you're going to automatically have a job, you're going to be in a 5-star hotel, unquote. Also making news from New York is Governor Kathy Hochul, who said this on CBS Sunday.
We want them to have a limit on who can come across the border. It is too open right now. People coming from all over the world are finding their way through, simply saying they need asylum, and the majority of them seem to be ending up in the streets of New York, and that is a real problem for New York City. 125,000 newly arrived individuals, and we are being taxed. Now, we are always so proud of the fact that New York has the Statue of Liberty in our harbor. We are one of the most diverse places on earth because of our welcoming nature, and it's in our DNA to welcome immigrants. But there has to be some limits in place, and Congress has to put more controls at the border, and not in this budget threat, shutdown threat. Talk about eliminating positions for Border Patrol when we actually need to double or quadruple those numbers. So get back to work and do your jobs.
Monet, do you think that this PR tour by Mayor Eric Adams is mostly for show? And then am I right in reading that Governor Hochul now backed off what she said over the weekend, which was a pretty strong statement, including the border is too open and maybe we need to quadruple the Border Patrol?
Absolutely. So I wanted to start by addressing something you said when introducing the topic, which is that the Democrats are showing their split personality on the border. I think that's actually a little bit too charitable toward the Democrats. Frankly, they, on principle, are still very opposed to border security generally. And frankly, if they had it their way, would prefer to allow more immigrants to be able to enter the country freely, especially if they were only ending up in border states, which tend to be Republican run. The only reason you're seeing them begin to intervene a little bit more recently is because, as Kathy Hochul alluded to in that clip, you're now seeing very large numbers of migrants end up in New York City. More than 100,000 are in city shelters, and it's becoming a drain on the city's resources and also causing a certain amount of public disorder. And so that's why you're kind of seeing Democrats recently be forced into action. But frankly, Eric Adams is deciding to take this trip south of the border. He's going to Mexico, Ecuador, and Colombia, basically to talk with politicians there, see if there's any way that they could intervene, and also to spread the word to migrants. I do think is mostly for show. Frankly, he wants New Yorkers to see that he's taking it seriously and that he's willing to go out in public, get out of home, and potentially spread the word that New York is not trying to continue as a safe haven for any migrant who likes to come. But it's not really going to have very much impact on policy. The only way that you'll see a change in policy is if President Biden decides he wants to spend the political capital to make a push to actually amend the enforcement of asylum law, which currently allows just about anybody to declare that they're seeking asylum and then enter the country indefinitely while they await their trial. But Kathy Hochul and other Democrats, even though they're feeling the pain from this uncontrolled migration, have been unwilling to publicly attack the president for failing to lead on that issue. So until they're willing to do that, it's very likely that we're still going to see the high numbers of illegal crossings that we've had in the past couple of months.
The other fascinating border story this week began with some news reports. Here's one from the Associated Press. It says the Biden administration announced they had waived 26 federal laws in South Texas to allow border wall construction on Wednesday, marking the administration's first use of sweeping executive power to pave the way for building more border barriers. The story goes on to say that there were no maps that came along with this announcement, but that a previous map suggested that this was some piecemeal construction that would add up to an additional 20 miles of the barrier system in the area. And normally, it seems to me that would be a pretty unremarkable news story. There's all sorts of border barriers along the U.S.-Mexico line. the administration, the White House, providing some funding, providing some regulatory greasing of the skids to augment some of that in some place. 20 miles is a pretty small portion, would generally go unremarked. But part of what made this so fascinating was President Biden's response then when he was asked about it. Listen to this.
The border wall, the money was appropriated for the border wall. I tried to get them to reappropriate, to redirect that money. They didn't, they wouldn't. And in the meantime, there's nothing under the law other than they have to use the money for what was appropriated. I can't stop that.
Do you believe the border wall works?
No.
Kim, what do you make of this? The president essentially saying there, I don't want to build this, but I don't have the power to not spend this money that's been appropriated.
Yeah, it's kind of become remarkable to me, Kyle, how polarizing the idea of barriers and fences and walls are. If you go back all the way decades and decades ago, the United States has a long history of trying to shore up its border with different barriers or fences, whatever it is, for a very long time. And in fact, Democrats also used to be in favor of that. Look, we know that sometimes these barriers work, sometimes they don't. It kind of depends where they are, etc. But the left's reaction to Donald Trump and his wall have now become this dogmatic thing. And apparently everyone must be opposed on the left to walls all the time. And so you end up with this absurd situation where we're talking about 20 miles of border wall. Why not just be the president, say, look, it's an additional step I'm taking to try to send the message that the border is closed, that the border is not open. And instead, he gets all these news stories where he's saying that walls don't work and that he's explaining that these funds were appropriated back in 2019 before he took office. And that he tried to get lawmakers to redirect it, but he had no choice. And it had to be used on some sort of barrier, and the construction had to be completed in 2023 according to the law. Now, okay, put aside the question that this is an administration that doesn't tend to normally have a lot of care about following the law. And, there's some big questions, too, about the proactive decision they took to waive these 26 different laws in order to allow this to go ahead. But I think it goes back to what you and Monet were just talking about, the fact that he's so eager and rushing so hard to suggest his hands were tied and he could do nothing just says so much about the power the progressive left has over the party at the moment. So let's say he did have to do this. Take a little credit for it. But no, instead, he's going to apologize. Again, just dancing to the tune of those who don't want there to be any asylum laws whatsoever.
Yeah, that seems like a pretty fair assessment of this to me. And it's strange to me, and I think counterproductive to President Biden's interests on two levels. Benet, I understand why Mayor Eric Adams says what he says and does what he does and is reluctant to criticize the Democratic president because he is the mayor of a very blue city. And that is the voter base that he is dealing with when he is up for election or reelection. The same goes for Kathy Hochul. I'm not sure if the blowback to what she said on CBS over the weekend was strong enough that she will say anything like that ever again. But to the extent that she's backtracking from that and moving from the rhetoric of saying the border needs not to be open, we need to quadruple the border patrol, to saying more fuzzy things about how she wants a balanced solution from Congress. I understand the incentive for her to do that, given that similarly she is in a very blue state, and those are the voters that she is going to face when she comes up to reelection. But President Biden, purely on the political matter, faces different incentives. He has no real opposition for the Democratic nomination in 2024. That seems to be pretty much a lock. And yet it looks like there are polls that show him competitive with the Republican candidates. And so you'd think that his incentive would be to pitch to the center and don't worry about angering some of those progressives who don't like the idea of a border wall, qua a border wall, and say, we are moving to fix this problem, even if it's true that this is previously appropriated money that the president doesn't have the power not to spend. You can still take credit for it. And the second is just what Mayor Eric Adams is going for by taking this trip and telling people that there is no five-star hotel waiting for you. Even if President Biden exaggerated the extent of this construction, it's only 20 miles. But if he said, we have a border problem and we are beginning this construction, the border is not open, maybe that would send a similar sort of message to migrants who are not on the way, but are thinking about whether they would be able to get into the United States and make the same asylum claim that thousands before them have already done.
Exactly. I think that President Biden is really trying to split the difference on the issue. On the one hand, we have reports from Customs and Border Patrol that more than 260,000 illegal migrants were apprehended at the southwest border last month, which would be an all-time record. The previous month, it was about 230,000, so it's been very, very high, basically since the summer heat has started to wind down, and a lot of those migrants, as Kathy Hochul said, are ending up in New York and in other northern cities. And so there's more political pressure than ever to intervene. But on the other hand, I think part of the explanation for why President Biden is reluctant to come out and say that he has taken the border seriously and take credit for building part of that barrier is because he knows that there is a very, very fervent and active left, which will hold his feet to the fire if he's seen as doing anything that can really be construed as aggressively immigration restrictionist. I think you can look to the recent words of Chicago's mayor, Brandon Johnson, who also announced that he's going to come down to the border because more migrants have come to his city, in understanding the psychology of President Biden on this issue. Brandon Johnson said he believes that asylum is a human right, that the migrants in his city have a right to be there, and does not want to see any restrictions on their ability to flow. The only thing he's asking for is more federal help, more federal dollars to defray the cost that Chicago's incurring by having to care for these migrants. And I think that President Biden probably believes something similar, and certainly knows that very powerful people in his party do. They think that even if a lot of these asylum claimants are coming really for economic problems, that there should essentially be a right to enter for that or any other purpose that someone claims when they cross the border. And so they now realize that for the sake of politics, they have to make sure it looks like an orderly flow. They don't want to have migrants overflowing in cities like New York or also at the border, because that's when voters start to put pressure on the government to act. But they also don't want to come out and say that we're doing something permanent, like building a wall or like changing the asylum laws, that's going to decrease the ability of people to enter this country when they're fleeing bad economic circumstances in their home country. And so that's exactly why you see them taking these sort of split the difference approaches, not on the one hand coming out in favor of very active permanent restriction, but also trying to do piecemeal things that they think will reduce the record numbers of people who have been crossing recently.